Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another one of our special podcasts here for Calvary Baptist in Gaylord, Michigan. You may recall that in the last few months I've done a couple of interviews with some of our members who hold different positions of leadership within the church, whether they be teaching roles or serving in a trustee position or something like that. In the case of the past, I interviewed Sherry Johnson, and we talked a lot about the history of the church. And then I went over and had a great visit with Larry Teal, and we talked about just some of Larry's background, not only growing up in Imlay City, but also what fascinated him about the Bible, and including the fact that Larry actually has a book that's published. I think it was called Baptist Bibles in Britannia. Uh, it's still available on Amazon.com. They are used copies, but nonetheless, Dwayne Larry Teal is actually his full name. But today we have an interview with somebody who is certainly no less accomplished than those two and brings her own unique set of skills. Many of us have gotten to know Lois Olson over the past few years, but she has some background that I'm guessing that most of us don't know. So we're going to talk about that today, and hopefully we'll be able to have a good time with this and that you'll enjoy this interview. So Lois, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good morning.
We did have you on one of the primetime Sunday night Bible studies in the earlier versions, back during when things were pretty well closed down. And we were talking about some chapters in Exodus, but today we want to talk about something a little more recent, and that's within the last 70 or so years, instead of 3,500 years ago. And so I want to talk about your life. Tell us a little bit. Where'd you grow up?
Royal Oak. I'm born and raised in Royal Oak.
The Detroit suburbs.
Yes.
Where I grew up, on the east side, Royal Oak it wasn't entirely like going over to Southfield or Livonia, but at the same time it was far enough away that before they built the 696 connector across there, it took a while to get over to that side of the suburbs.
Yeah.
And so you went to high school in Royal Oak, and am I right? It was at Royal Oak High School. It was before they split into two schools. Is that correct?
No, there was Dondero and there was Kimball.
And
we had two.
And you went to which one?
Kimball.
You went to Kimball.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
For 2 years, and then we moved up to Holly.
To Holly. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's up by Fenton.
Right.
The somewhat south of Flint. It's northern Oakland County.
Northwestern. Yeah, right in the corner.
Right up there in the corner.
Yeah.
And your father, what did your father do for a living?
He worked for Ford Motor Company. He was a high-low repairman.
So he worked for Ford.
Right.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's like so many of us who grew up in the Detroit suburbs, if one of our parents didn't work for one of the big three, they very likely worked for some organization that depended on the big three. And that was just part of the sign of the times.
And then my mother was a nurse in the first wave of staff that went into Beaumont Hospital. We grew up in the shadow of Beaumont, and so she was one of the first nurses that went into Beaumont.
Okay. Mm-hmm. William Beaumont Hospital there in Royal Oak is where Terry's and my niece now works as a nurse.
It's a huge complex now.
Very well known, well respected. All right, and so you finished high school there in Holly, excuse me.
Holly. Mm-hmm.
And what came next?
Well, my one brother had gone into the Air Force, and then the other one was still in high school, of course. So not knowing what direction to go, as 20 years old and having worked 2 jobs, and Norman came home and said, consider the Air Force. So I did, and a gal that I was working with at the veterinarian clinic, she and I enlisted together and went on to Lackland, and I went into the Air Force.
So your jobs after high school, you worked at a veterinary clinic?
For one of them, and then a hospital,
okay.
The other one.
So you go in and you joined the Air Force, and how many years were you with the Air Force?
4, just shy of 4.
Okay.
Yeah, when we adopted our first child, I had to get out because there weren't provisions at that time for a person to have a dependent and be in the Air Force.
And what year was that you
That was
joined?
66 that I went in.
66. So you went in as Vietnam was really starting to heat up.
Yes.
And am I correct that you were always here? You never were sent over there?
Right, Southern California was where I was
Okay.
stationed.
And so then after your time in the Air Force, what kinds of duties did you have while you were there?
Um, well, it was under the label of veterinary services, but most of what we did was food inspection, facility inspections. We did off base food inspection for food coming into the base. We had a shot clinic basically for pets, for Air Force, well, military people to bring their pets in. Um, so and we had a lot of sentry dogs at the time with Vietnam being um, so hot. We sent a lot of sentry dogs overseas. So we had about 25 at
Okay.
the base that we took care of.
And so then after your time in the Air Force is finished, it would have been what, 1970 or
Correct.
okay.
hmm
And did you come back to Michigan or what was next for you?
No, stayed in Southern California. I had been married at the time, and so we were in California until '72, and then my husband had orders for Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C., so we moved east and started all over again, as military families do when they go to a new station.
All right. And so you're out of the service at that point,
hmm
and you're in the D.C. area.
Correct.
And so what was the next chapter in your life?
Well, I had wanted to go to school. I found out part of my discharge planning was to see what benefits that I had, and I had accrued quite uh, an opportunity to go on to college, and so
Would that have been part of GI Bill?
they didn't call it that, but that's basically what it was.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was eligible for vocational rehabilitation because of some back injuries I had while I was in, and so I was able to go under that label or not that plan.
Sure.
Um, so I had really wanted to increase my knowledge of the Bible. I had been in a couple of Bible studies, and it just made me hungry to learn more about the scriptures. And I found out that I was within 15 miles of Washington Bible College, and so it was very convenient for me to enroll there. And then I was able to get my degree from Washington Bible College in Bible and Christian education. And then I wanted to go on to grad school. I had the benefits to go to grad school, so I stayed in Washington D.C. And went to Catholic University of America and got my graduate degree in there, and that was in psychology.
That was a Master of Psychology, was it?
Well, actually, it was a master's, and then in behavioral science, which was slash psychology, and then later on, I was able to get my Michigan licensure
Mm-hmm. Okay.
as a psychologist.
Then you worked in that capacity for a period of time, is that correct?
Right, right, yeah. I started actually my first work situation after after school was in a Christian school in D.C. area. It was a large Christian school, and I had a quite a advanced special ed program that I had designed, and because special ed in Christian schools is just something that is almost unheard of.
At that point, completely, even today, there's still um, there are very few Christian schools that are set up to provide the needs,
Right. That's true.
the instructional needs.
That's true.
Um, so you're in that Christian school in D.C. and you also were a teacher there. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I was doing was teaching special ed, and then supervising the other teachers that we had in our department.
And how many years were you in that organization?
4. I taught there for 4 years, and in the meantime, I had a family life. We had adopted 5 more children internationally, special needs children. So there was a lot of time spent on family issues, or family, whatever, and family,
Right.
and
Well,
because
children take time, and if they do have some particular needs, some special needs, it just that just increases that level of need there,
sure,
that commitment.
even the issue of language, they did not speak language English when they came, and so just learning language was quite the interesting facet of it.
What was now your where did they were they obviously were not infants when you adopted them.
No, school agers.
Okay.
All of them were school agers. 2 of them were 10. 2 of them were 8. One was 7.
And which where had they come from?
2 of the boys came from Korea, and the 2 girls came from India, and then one from Brazil. And then, of course, Michael was already here from the States, so he was our American child. And then with their special needs, 3 of the boys had polio, which is unheard of in our country, but in poor areas of third world nations, polio is quite rampant, and so they 3 of them were paraplegic from polio.
That's because the vaccination was not available in their country at the time.
Correct. Yeah.
I know that when that Jonas Salk vaccine came out, it was just considered just such a miracle. What a difference that made.
Oh yeah. Oh yes.
All right, and so when did your time in the D.C. area come to an end?
We left the D.C. area in '85.
So you were out there a good 15 years.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, and in the meantime, my children's father had retired from the Air Force.
So he stayed in.
Right. Yes,
Okay.
he was career. And we moved to Marquette, in the UP.
Wow,
So that was quite a transition.
that is indeed.
We
And-
wanted to get as far away from D.C. as we possibly could. And Marquette was sort of the edge of the planet.
So what was the position that drew you guys to Marquette?
I thought that Marquette University was in Marquette, and I wanted to go on and get a doctorate at Marquette University.
That's the one in Wisconsin.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so that was our goal, and we wanted to get away from D.C., and so we just started looking for housing in Marquette, and then I found out, of course, that it was not the right university, but Northern was there, and I was able to start picking up some classes at Northern.
Okay. So you actually you did do some coursework beyond the master's level.
Right,
in
right.
a doctoral program, or was it more going to be another master's?
It was another master's at the time because there wasn't anything at Northern that would have coincided with what I already
Sure.
had.
And at that point, Northern Michigan probably was primarily focused on the undergraduate level. Uh,
Yes.
the same was the case in that era when I was at Central Michigan. Yes, there were master's programs, but the big emphasis and the large student enrollment was at the undergrad level. And today
Mm-hmm.
it's probably a little more balanced. But so you're in Marquette and you say, "Wow, it snows a lot here." But other than that, you held positions there.
I worked for mental health in Marquette. At the time, I was working in adult foster care facility for disabled, developmentally disabled adults, and at the work center. And then in '87, uh, I moved on to Manistee. Three of the boys moved with me.
That's Manistee on Route 2 in the Upper Peninsula, not
Right,
Manistee on Lake Michigan down by Ludington.
Ludington.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
you've got to get the k on the end of Manistee.
okay. Well, if it's pronounced with the local enunciation up in the UP, it would be you were in Manistee, eh?
Yes, yes, that's right.
And there was that a different job that you held when you were in Manistee?
When I went to Manistee, I worked for mental health again as a therapist, outpatient therapy, and so I worked there as a therapist for 4 years, and then went over to Escanaba. I commuted from Manistee to Escanaba.
Wow,
Um,
that's a full hour, isn't or a little
it's a
more?
full hour in the winter time. It was about an hour and a
I
half
was
to
just going to
two
say,
hours.
along Route 2 there can be some pretty brutal whiteouts
Yes,
when it's right up on the water.
yes, and that's what it was. It was right along the water, and so I worked there with developmentally disabled adults, and I really enjoyed working in that capacity. Um, and I did mostly behavioral plans, evaluations, working with staff. So it was a good position.
Now, somewhere in there, you switched roles and you worked actually for Child Protective Services.
Right. Yeah. The commute to Escanaba was just getting a little old,
Sure.
and
And
position
expensive,
and expensive. Right.
because that would have been, oh, let's see, by then you were probably in the late 80s to early 90s.
Um, Early '90s.
Okay. And certainly the price of gas had come down from the way it was in the late 70s and through until the mid 80s. It was up there, and then it started a
Mm-hmm.
gradual decline, but compared to our incomes, it was still fairly expensive. And um, then in the early 2000s, I mean, it came down a lot until in 2008 when we were paying over $4 a gallon.
Yeah.
I remember that one.
Yeah.
That was when I dumped a car that I absolutely loved, but it used premium gas, and
Uh-huh.
that had to go away.
That had to go.
Oh,
So I started working at back in Manistee as a protective service worker for children, and I held that position for about 5 years until I retired.
very challenging position.
Very challenging position.
Heartbreaking at times.
Mm.
Just, but but even then, I think of the other roles that you've held over the years. I mean, these were positions that just required not only great knowledge but great sensitivity, patience, maturity. Um, but it does take its toll on you, doesn't it?
Right. Yes. When I retired, I was very tired.
You didn't have to retire; you were already there.
I was already there. Right. And in the meantime, I had a farm, and I raised dairy goats, and so I put about 25 years into my dairy goat farm, and showing and breeding and milking and providing little ones for 4-H children. Um, so that was my relaxation, was having my dairy goats.
I remember you've talked about your goats a fair amount. And so then after you left Manistee, where did you go to?
I sold my farm and went to Wisconsin for a couple of years, and I was working on a cow dairy farm, milking cows, taking care of calves, um, feeding, just doing dairy farm work. That was a good break, but my age and my knees weren't as cooperative, and it was short lived, and I came back um, to Michigan in '03, no, in '02.
Was that when you moved to the Wolverine area?
Initially to Alanson, and then bought property in Wolverine to get my farm started again.
Okay.
hmm
And at that point, your brother was in the area. Am I correct?
Correct. Yeah, he lived in Alanson before he moved to Alaska.
And he actually was pastoring a small church in the Alanson area.
Yeah, yes, and well, actually, the church was in Wolverine.
It was in Wolverine.
hmm
Okay. And it was during that time that you also um, you had been attending church in a couple of different denominations because, like myself, you are something of a theological mongrel.
That's a good way to put it.
A
Yes.
religious mutt, somebody called me. You and I both have some years and some background in Lutheranism,
That's right.
particularly conservative brands
hmm
of Lutheranism. But you were raised in a very conservative, fundamental Baptist church, and
That's
of
right.
the old 60s and 70s varieties of fundamental Baptist churches. And yet you spent a period of time attending an Episcopal church.
That's right.
What was your draw to that?
Liturgy. I love liturgy, and whether it's in the Lutheran church or in the Episcopal church, um, I I'm just drawn to that. But there were such changes that were being made in the Episcopal church in the '90s that I just could not abide by. At one point in time, I wanted to um, go on to seminary and actually become an Episcopal priest, but
So the Episcopal Church would ordain women,
yes,
and those that do that might be on many other things really pretty conservative and solid, but they have made that choice, uh, which would never be an opportunity that you would have in most Baptist churches.
correct.
Exception being the American Baptist Church denomination, but other than that, for the most part, the opportunities for women in even teaching positions in Baptist churches have been pretty limited.
Right. But that wasn't the main factor. It was the gender factor and the homosexuality factor.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't abide by that.
Sure.
And so I had to um, leave the Episcopal church, and I went back to an independent Baptist church.
And part of that was because your brother Norman knew Pastor Jay Chambers, or at least knew of him.
Right,
And he kind of suggested, why don't you go down to Gaylord and go to Calvary Baptist? I know those guys.
right, right. And so that's how I ended up here at Calvary.
About, what, 2006 or 5
Roughly,
or somewhere in there?
somewhere in there,
Okay.
yes. Uh-huh.
And then you've been here ever since, and you've seen the church go through some difficult times and some good times and some bigger times and some smaller times. And
Right, right.
um, you're one of those who has stuck with it through the highs and the lows.
Yeah,
Um, there's really only there may be 7 or 8 of you
that was
that have really stuck through it all.
yeah, that's what carried the church for a while. Um,
Sure.
mhm.
Churches go through seasons, but sometimes we wish that the seasons didn't have such big swings.
Right.
So, so let's talk a little bit about your fascination with Scripture, and in particular, your fascination with Old Testament studies.
Yes.
Um, on Sunday nights, we've been going through the book of Exodus, and it's been in passages in which I've drawn the comparison of how so much of the ornateness and some of the liturgical basis of things that we see in denominations, yes, in Roman Catholicism, but in their Protestant derivations, particularly the Lutherans and the Anglican Church.
Hmm.
I suppose the Presbyterian Church too. Um, those three maintain those high church traditions, and I've talked about how we come from something with a heavier Puritan roots, and ours are more of what we would call low church.
Hmm.
Low doesn't mean less; it just simply means it's not as ornate. It is more um, perhaps user friendly, but
Right.
at the same time, there is a meaning and a significance to all of that liturgy, and it all traces its roots back to so many of those things in the Old Testament too.
Well, we have our own liturgy.
We
We
do. We just don't
we
recognize
we
it as
don't
that.
recognize it as that. Liturgy just means order of service,
Yeah.
and so we have our own order of service slash liturgy.
Yep. We do. Um, but you gained a particular fascination with matters Old Testament.
Old Testament, yes.
Um, and in many Baptist churches, that probably raises an eyebrow or two. And yet, three-quarters of the Bible is the Old Testament.
That's right.
And
That's
so
right.
often we overlook that. You became involved with a study um, and an organization called First Fruits of Zion.
That's right.
And then you felt led to organize a group here in town, and it met at your house for a while. And now, very often, it will meet here in our reception room at the church. It's not formally a ministry of Calvary Baptist, and yet at the same time, you use the facilities, and most of your participants are people here at the church. You call it the Torah Club,
Right.
and many people may not realize what Torah is. Can you talk about that a little bit? The meaning of
Sure.
the word, and for that matter, what your group is all about.
Sure. Well, I studied Torah, the materials from First Fruits of Zion by myself for 4 years, and I didn't have anybody to study with. And each year it's cyclical. We go. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the writings of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and in the yearly cycle go through the Torah from September until the following September. So I studied with materials by myself, and didn't really have anybody to study with. Um, I found out through First Fruits of Zion that there was a program called the Torah Club, um, which had there was a leader of the group, and then those that wanted to also study Torah. Um, I started with a small group of people, friends from the church here, and the first series was Unrolling the Scroll, going through those first 5 books for the year. Each week there is what's called a parasha, and that's the reading for that week. And usually it's 4 to 5 chapters of Torah, right on through. We have workbooks that we work on. We have great discussion groups. Um, the first one was Unrolling the Scroll, and then this last one we did Shadows of the Messiah. How Messiah is, how Jesus is shadowed through the Torah in so many ways. and that's looking forward to the Messiah's coming. And then this year, starting in October, for the year, we're going to be studying. It's going to be a great study on Jesus, my Rabbi. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus followed Torah. Jesus lived Torah. He was Torah. Um, John 1:1, the Word became flesh. And Jesus was that God breathed Torah in flesh. And so we're going to be studying that for this next year. And it's open to anybody that wants to join. I'd be more than happy to talk to anybody about it. Get in touch with me through church, through Pastor Jim. Um, Call the church and make that connection. I'd be glad to call you back and we can talk about it and um, get some interest in it.
You regularly each week have, it varies between, say, 4 and 6, maybe 7 people that participate. And then on Saturdays, you often will go over to Charlevoix with a group of others who are pursuing this same kind of study. And it's important that people understand that we're not attempting to convert to Judaism. Quite the contrary. What we're trying to do is recognize Christianity through an Old Testament lens. And I've had people, of course, who have said that I'm not really Baptist. Well, I kind of chuckle at that because anybody who isn't Baptist says, "Oh my goodness, is he ever Baptist?" But the point is that we can't be so thin. And my criticism of so many Baptists is that their faith is about paper thin. There's no maturity and no depth to it. And that depth comes from understanding the history and the Old Testament scriptures. And so that's why I've been very supportive of your efforts, simply because it plays into that, because the focus of it is all on the pointing towards the coming of Christ.
That's exactly right. In when Paul wrote to Timothy, second Timothy, says all Scripture is given by the inspiration of God, and it's profitable for teaching, for correction, for to equip us for good works. And you see, there was no New Testament. The all Scripture that was inspired at that time was the Hebrew Scriptures, was the Torah, was the Psalms,
And the
the
prophets
poetic,
and the books of history. And,
that's right.
yes, all of those.
And that's what prepares us now for our time in New Testament times. It's a foundation. It's the highest sod, the foundation. And yes, we attend a messianic group in Charlevoix. There are 25, 30 people that meet on Saturday afternoons on Shabbat. A messianic group in Charlevoix. And we go over there every Shabbat. Our service is reading the parashat, the readings for the day, those 4 or 5 chapters, not just a couple of verses like we do in so many of our churches, our quote Christian churches unquote, but we read at 4 or 5 chapters and have a message, and we have time of worship and praise and prayers, and then we have a time of fellowship. It's potluck every week. So there's a time of fellowship.
That sounds like a group of Baptists.
There's always food. There's always food. We just, this past weekend, we just celebrated Yom Teruah, which is Feast of Trumpets. And that begins the 10 days of awe, which end in Yom Kippur on the 28th.
The Day of Atonement.
The Day of Atonement, that's right. And So we this during this next 8 days that we have, days of repentance, days of introspection. Um, and again, it's not a matter of making Jews out of Baptists, but it's an opportunity to celebrate our background in the Jewish faith. We started as Jews. Um, we're grafted into Abraham. Scripture tells us that we're the wild branch that's been grafted in, and so we have a lot to share with our Jewish friends, and so it's really an opportunity to rejoice in that
And a
history.
potential witness opportunity
Oh
that those
yes,
who do not yet recognize that Jesus is their
their
Messiah,
Messiah. That's
that
right.
there is still time for them to come to realize that.
And not only the Jews, but every you go to
Obviously, yeah.
Myers and or any of the stores. I mean, people in general, people don't know that Jesus is Messiah. They just know him as a curse word, and they don't realize who he is.
Or for
And
that matter, if they do have a more respectful view of him, it is of the wise teacher, great kind counselor, but not as the Son of God, let alone God Himself wrapped in human flesh,
right,
who was prophesied to come. That they emphasize His humanity much more than His divinity.
and he is coming back. Um, we at the beginning of our service, um, it's almost always that the statement is made, we're one day closer to Messiah's return. We're the closest generation to his return, and we we just hang on to that, realizing that one day closer, and it's exciting to think that. Get up in the morning and you think, one day closer to Jesus' return, and it gives us joy to go on through the day then.
Oh, and it's a study that brings a unique perspective, something that really is, it just isn't typically emphasized as much in a traditional, any of the Christian denominations, quite honestly. Um, I think it is a great supplement, a great lens is the term that I use a lot
Mm-hmm.
to look at this through, and so that's why I've encouraged you and have encouraged those who are participants in it. If people need to get a hold of you about this and they have particular interest, they can call the church here and leave a message if they wanted to. We'd be happy to get back to you. The phone number is 989-732-4001, or you could just send an email to the church, cbcgaylord at gmail.com, cbcgaylord at gmail.com. And we would be happy to get back in touch with you. As we said, it's not formally a ministry of Calvary Baptist, but it's certainly one that many of our folks are involved with, and we do host it here, just like there are other ministries in town that we do host that aren't our own. Right to Life meets here regularly. There's a men's group that meets here on Monday nights. It isn't formally a Calvary Baptist ministry, and it involves people who don't go here. And we're certainly happy to be able to host that. There are all ways of trying to connect with people and to have them realize that the Bible is true and God's promises are real, and Jesus is who He says He is, and He is coming again one day. And will we be ready? And how are
Right.
we ready? And our ready is that we have to place our faith and our trust in Him, recognizing that He is exactly who He says He is.
Right. And part of being who he says he is, Jesus is a Jew. And we're having this opportunity to look at that and study that, and study his life over this next year. So I'd really invite people to consider getting in touch.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing just your story and just some of your background. Many people who only know you peripherally would have no idea of all the different roles that you've held, including your training and your work as a psychologist. Um, it's just one of those things that so often people don't realize some of the diverse backgrounds that we come from.
Psychologist and a goat farmer.
Psychologist and a goat farmer.
Yes.
Something tells me that there were times that being the goat farmer was far less stressful,
Oh my. Oh my, yes.
much more peaceful. Um, One of the things about ministry and about farming that has some similarities, and that's that generally sheep are very gentle animals, but every now and then they do bite. At least one of my pastor friends says that. He says, yeah, the sheep sometimes do bite.
Oh,
Well, thank you so much once again. I know that you have some work to do here. Lois serves as our treasurer, so she has some bookkeeping work to do, and so I need to get out of her way so she can do that.
well, thank you for your time here and being able to share this with the people.
All right. Thanks for coming. And once again, thank you everybody for listening in, or as we used to say in my radio days, thank you for tuning in. It's amazing what technology allows us to do. We have essentially a private, on-demand radio feed directly into the home of anybody with an internet connection. And if you found this interview interesting, go ahead and share it. Send the link to it to people who you think might be interested. It's an outreach of Calvary Baptist, and certainly is part of an effort to try to have us serve this community. But now, through the power of technology, this community could be anywhere in the world. Just ponder that thought and just give thanks for all the positive, good uses of modern technology. Let us emphasize those and certainly help one another to avoid the potential pitfalls. Thank you once again for listening. We appreciate your time. God bless you all. Have a great day, and just remember, Jesus is coming again, perhaps very soon. Are you ready? Have a great day. Take care.